Thank you for that, and welcome to everyone, members of the public and staff and those online. Apologies from Nicola Delatour, Christine Rankin and Steve Mananui, who will be a little bit late. So we'll get underway with the long-term plan. So Kendall, are you leading this?
I'll be here for a little bit.
Thank you, the microphone's yours.
Good morning, everybody. This morning we will kick things off with Sarah again, doing the third edition of the financial strategy. And then we will jump into transport and the parks and reserves as our first two activities. Then there's a break for lunch. And then you have another workshop, and then we will come back to the table where we will do 5 more activities. And I think we should be wrapping up before we've actually indicated in the invitation. So hopefully we get there. But yeah, otherwise I will hand it over to Sarah for another edition.
Morena. Third edition, that sounds very like a big novel.
It is.
Right. We'll kick it off. So we will quickly do similar to what we've done the last workshop. So just a little recap on financial strategy before we dive into the next 3 parts today, which are level of service, infrastructure, depreciation and growth. So all somewhat related topics. So the recap, again, constant push for, hey, if you want to understand financial strategies, have a look at our last one. Also, again, it's a very legislative document, so obviously what we do and don't include, certainly set by legislation along with sector best practice, and our last year's one's a good guide. But obviously, yeah, as Kendall just flipped past, very different environment this time. Now, we'll put stars next to the ones we've talked about, and then today we're talking about the next 3. So we'll be over halfway through today of the deep dives into those proposed key parts of the financial strategy, which is pretty exciting. So you'll be rid of me in a couple of workshops. I'll be back, yes, I will be back. Now, level of service and infrastructure. So this is obviously quite a large piece of the puzzle and takes up quite a large section of the financial strategy, given the amount of costs that are obviously driven by not only level of service from what services do we deliver to the community, so a high level overview of, hey, what's council's plans in this space, but then also infrastructure and infrastructure projects and what are we actually delivering. So this should provide a really good link to the infrastructure strategies, as well as the water service strategy. And then again, at that high level, it kind of covers what council's plans are with the other activities. Are we, maintaining current levels of service? Are we reducing levels of service? What is the long-term strategy that links the cost, from a delivery perspective? And then, of course, this area has a massive impact on financial prudence measures, and there's quite a few of them in this section, which I'll talk about next. So from the last long-term plan, basically service levels were maintained for the most part across council services, and then we also had new projects. The plan really was to prioritise that essential infrastructure up front, and you'll see that in a number of the prudence measures and metrics we've got. We also plan to ensure we fully funded depreciation, and that's, of course, council's share of depreciation. So, for example, when there's transportation projects that are funded by Waka Kotahi, we only fund our share of what the replacement would be. So depreciation fully funded from a what council intends to replace perspective. It also had a big intergenerational equity focus. So again, how we use debt to fund those projects, how we spread those over the life of the asset, how we make sure the right ratepayers are paying for the assets that we're delivering and the services that we're delivering. we did. There was a bit of a note in there about how inflation pressure has really, caused asset costs and construction costs to increase, and that we were managing that challenge through what we delivered. So again, that was a big focus. And also the deliverability lens on the capital program. So we referenced the fact that we've had a large amount of carry forwards for a number of years, and how we plan to approach the deliverability of the capital program and make sure that that was relevant going into the long-term plan. I'm not sure we quite nailed it, but we also recognised that it was going to take a little bit of work. Again, some of those disciplines we've ensured we delivered include forecasting and the like to try and get this area a lot more under control. And then, obviously the costs are driven by growth demand. District's growth obviously informs how much we spend on different assets, level of service, and then replacement. So again, looking after what we've got. And the water services and reform a key pressure point, and you'll see that later, particularly in the level of service projects. So we've done a number of level of service projects because it's different to what we've done before, but it's because we've actually had to from a waters legislation perspective. So some of those treatment plants that have had to have upgrades, the protozoa barriers, all of that kind of stuff. I could go on for days about waters infrastructure. Sorry. Anyway, moving on. Now, essential services. So let's revisit the last long-term plan and just talking about how we were delivering a lot up front. Now, this measure is capital expenditure compared to depreciation. So how much of our assets are we replacing? And as you can see again, what I was talking about before about that upfront spend. We were again replacing about the level of service, particularly in that water space. So essentially we were spending more on capital expenditure than our depreciation, which basically means we are adding more assets than are depreciating. So common in the growth, in a growth council, common because of waters improvements we had to make, but that's kind of a picture of actually over this 10 years, councils added a lot of new assets that we then have to maintain and have to, that affects operating costs as well. So that's a good benchmark. And again, coming to the end of the long-term plan, we were expecting that to slow down and just replace the assets that we had based on the fact that there are no further legislative changes, of course. Now, balanced budget. This is a good prudence measure, and basically this is that our revenue is funding our operating expenditure. Now, this graph does not necessarily look like this across the sector, and I know there's many councils that are challenged from a balanced budget perspective. Again, it's one of the prudence measures that, and I know your Chair of Risk and Assurance looks very closely at this, because essentially, if you are non-funding things or funding operating costs with loans, you'll see an unbalanced budget. So this is quite a positive measure. Some of this is impacted because at the end of the long-term plan, we had planned to put a little bit of money back into the reserves because some of our reserves have been depleted through, again, some of that legislative work we had to do. So particularly our waters reserves were really under pressure. Some of the stuff at the end of the year was because we were actually planning to put a little bit more than depreciation into those reserves at the end of the long-term plan to replace what's been depleted. Now, capital expenditure drivers, again, probably just supporting what I was saying before. We've got here additional demand, so that's our growth projects, that's the darker blue down the bottom. Then we've got the orange in the middle, which is our level of service, and again, primarily this was waters projects. However, there were some level of service, so the Taharepa Crown roundabouts is a good example of a level of service project. We didn't have a roundabout there before. It's an improvement on what we did have there, so it's a level of service. So there are some examples of other level of service, but most of that was in the waters space. And then the light below at the top, that is our renewals, so looking after the assets we have. So that's quite an important graph, and I suspect that may change a little bit, this long-term plan. Waters aside, I suspect level of service projects are going to become increasingly hard to fund because of the ongoing operating costs. So again, under a rates cap environment, level of service projects are very hard.
Well,
Now,
through the chair, can I just ask? Well, my understanding, you're talking about level of service. Certainly, there's minimum levels of services being imposed upon us in the water services realm. But as far as transport goes, there's certainly not that imposition of level of service. So, for example, that Taharipa roundabouts, we chose to do them because we wanted to improve the level of services. It's not something, I'm just talking as someone that's in the industry, it's not something we have to do, but that's a choice. And for example, the second bridge, the new bridge across the Waikato to Nukahau, that would be a choice to do. It's not an imposition. It's not something we actually have to do. No one's pushing us to do it, and that is something which has not been debated in these chambers.
Councillor Campbell, can I just...
Oh, yeah.
We really should be in question. If you've got any questions, rather than a statement, it would be helpful.
Oh, okay. Do you agree?
it wouldn't be for me to comment on roading engineering as much as I love to sit here and talk about stuff. But I know some of those level of service projects are done from a safety perspective. They're done from a community want or need perspective. So there's a range of reasons why investment happens. And again, these come to the table through the long-term plan, and they've normally come with a really good business case behind them, unless there's stuff added at the last minute by the community, which sometimes challenges the amount of work we do to put into those business cases. But no, a lot of it is safety or a mixture of growth. So it's really hard because you get to that stage where you need to facilitate investment because of growth, but growth might only be 30% of the reason you're doing it, because it is a new asset, like you've said, from a level of service perspective. So there's a bit of a mix, but again, that should be informed by Tony's team when they come to us and say, this is the proposed investment and this is why, and then for this table to decide whether we go ahead with it or not.
I was just pointing out the contrast between water services, which are clearly being imposed upon us, a certain level of services, but other things, for example, transport. We'll say Auckland wasn't forced to build their motorways; they had to choose to do it in the end.
Sorry, through the chair, you're making statements again. If it's a question, this is question time. But we're not in Auckland; we're in Taupō. Last time
Do you
I
agree?
looked, in fact, I can see the lake out there.
Yeah, so I do agree that we've got less flexibility with waters, yes.
Through the chair, can I ask a question?
Please go ahead.
On my way around the most beautiful drive in the world to work that I did this morning around Lake Taupō, I was listening to a reporter from the UK. They are talking about the incredibly high cost of oil, literally overnight. That's going to impact us. Do we have any headroom anywhere to take into account these sorts of things when we're looking at the long-term plan?
Yeah, so this is a little bit of a struggle for us at the moment too, and I know there's a few staff members doing a little bit of work in this space, because obviously that will have a massive impact on not only costs but the deliverability. And again, that some of those core financials like depreciation, which do have a rates impact. So yeah, we've definitely been looked at the moment from a range of aspects really, but from a long-term plan perspective, it's kind of unclear where it will hit. We've just proposed to the auditor that we don't revalue our roading assets, because we think the uncertainty at the moment would result in a potential material difference in our fair value assessment of our assets. So we've proposing some things in that space to, hey, like, why don't we wait till it's stable until we can really assess the impact? Because I'd hate the community to all of a sudden have to fund all this extra depreciation, but then the costs stabilised, right? So it definitely has a big impact on costs and on some of these financial strategy measures and on what you can afford. And there is no buffer. We don't hold, when it's unexpected events, we don't hold any funding for these sorts of things because, our assumptions, you can't assume. Yeah.
Councillor Foreman, you have a question?
Yes, I do, and it might be answered later on, but I'm just trying to understand, first councillor, first year, how do we ensure that our community expectations, I guess, are aligned with the levels of expectation? Are we checking in consistently, or is it a one-hit wonder?
That might be a question for Hadley to answer, but that's all right. I'll have a go. But we do regular check-ins from a community expectation. I know Hadley's team's got a massive range of activities they do to check in with the community and to bring things back to the table where it's raised. But I think that is always a challenge during a long-term plan. Generally speaking, what you'll see, and what I had noticed in New South Wales that didn't change, is that community have expectations of, all of these things, but they don't want to necessarily pay for them, which is always the challenge, right? So as elected members, that is on you to make some of those tough choices and those trade-offs. So, well, if we do this, then what else do we cut back on? It's a constant battle, that one. Oh, and Kendall.
I was just going to say, I've been doing quite a bit of work with Hadley's team, which is the community engagement team and the iwi co-governance team as well. We've got the engagement plans ready to come to you, but what I will say is we really have been trying to think about where we go out and have purpose-built engagement sessions, but when we're not out there engaging, how are we balancing those community expectations and feeding that back to staff, and then vice versa, feeding that back to the community, so that it's not just a one-stop shop, that it's an open door policy, and we're trying to figure out how we best do that. So when we do bring that to you, any suggestions would be great, because that's one area that we would
like to
really like to
suggest
improve
that that's our role as councillors, and I connect constantly with my community, and I constantly have people texting me, emailing me, ringing me, and asking me those questions. So we do support you as much as we can in that communication role.
That's great, and it's making sure that we're filtering that back to the right people in the organisation to then get it back out to the community in a timely fashion. So really have a close eye on that, this particular LTP.
Next one. Now, what's different this time? So service level projects, which we've just talked about, so some of that level of service projects become really difficult. So building new assets that we then have to maintain, that we then have to charge depreciation funding on, that we then have loan funding, so we have to pay the costs of finance. So level of service projects become really challenging in a rates cap environment. So even when you look overseas at some of our counterparts like New South Wales and Victoria that have a lot of state and federal grants, really challenging for them, because often they don't want the grant funding because of the ongoing operational impact of increased level of service. So what you get is somewhat a continuation of status quo. Then obviously there'll be a continued prioritisation of core services. So linked to new legislation, now we know what central government have told us our core services as local government. Not a heap of change in this space, but particularly given we were already kind of doing that from an affordability perspective. But yeah, we will be likely to continue to prioritise core services. Such as roading and waters. Depreciation complexity, and I talked about this, I think it was the last workshop, likely warrants its own topic. Now, we're coming up against rating legislation which somewhat contradicts depreciation funding concepts and some of that financial prudence concepts, so juggling that, depending on kind of where we get to from a service perspective, from a deliverability perspective, funding that may be challenging, and then the complexity of this, two different legislations we're trying to manage, likely we'll split that out. So I'm going to talk about that further today as well. Intergenerational equity, again, will be challenged because debt is undesirable in a rates cap environment. I always run out of voice. Intergenerational equity, so the concept of splitting assets over time becomes challenging because the main mechanism to do that is debt, and debt is pretty challenging to manage with the fluctuating costs of capital. Inflation pressure wasn't as prevalent, although as Councillor Greenstate has added, there's a bit of uncertainty right now, but certainly it wasn't as prevalent as it had been through the last long-term plan and post-COVID inflation pressures. Deliverability lens, so that requires continued focus, especially in the regulatory environment. So when we set budgets, and I've talked about before, in that regulatory environment, there's a little bit of pressure to deliver, making sure that we're not either under-delivering or over-delivering, because there are consequences either way when you look over at the electricity sector and what they do there. So assuming that the regulatory environment will be very similar and it is the same regulator, we definitely need to continue working on that deliverability focus and make sure we're hitting those budgets that we tell the community we're delivering as well. We will still be driven by growth and demand. So, Taupō, you were presented the draft growth assumptions, the growth model, and that growth is planned to continue still at a higher rate than maybe what Stats New Zealand and what we had been expecting a number of years ago. Our growth has really continued to sit around that 2%. And then water services and reforms still a key pressure point. Tony's team still have a number of projects to deliver. Some of that legislation makes sure we're doing continued improvement to meet what's required under legislation, not just from a quality regulator perspective, but also from an economic regulator perspective. So waters will likely to continue to increase in costs, and as a result of the environment we are now under. Depreciation out on its own. So as I've said, in the last LTP it was in the level of service infrastructure section. So depreciation concepts though now are becoming challenged by that rates cap and which legislation comes first. It'll be interesting to see if central government addresses it, and maybe I leave it where it is. But again, given the careful trade-offs and navigation between the two legislation, I'm suggesting that this one might be a topic on its own to talk about how we're navigating that under the current environment. Funding, so that's just one word sitting there, but the funding again challenging, and I know through some of these workshops we've been doing, there's also been questions over, hey, are we funding too much depreciation? Will we replace some of these assets? So a number of examples have been given. So I think we need to spend a little bit of time at this table talking about that. Because potentially there are assets that we are depreciating that we may not replace in the future in a rates cap environment, or maybe if we did replace them, we'd look at external funding. So we'd say we'd get, the lotteries type grants or central government funding if we were to replace the service. So yes, the funding needs looking at. And then also possible departure from depreciation funding for water services, but that would need regulatory approval. Now, in our current water service strategy, we are depreciation funding. However, we know that particularly the water service entities are unlikely to do this. So we'll be comparing with peers who are not funding depreciation potentially, and we're not sure what the regulator will do in this space either. Is depreciation funding an appropriate measure for the long term for their water services?
Through the chair. Sarah, why are they not depreciating in the water services entities? What's the thinking behind that?
Yeah, depreciation funding is a little bit unique to local government. So even if you look at the electricity sector, it's not not done from a infrastructure funding perspective. Generally, you fund your renewals, you fund your lending, and then they have certain times to pay for it. So whether that will be looked at as an appropriate source of funding or not, again, in light of you might not necessarily be planning to replace assets as soon as they're due, or we know things change, so costs go up, and then you've got to fund a higher level than what you've depreciated for. So potentially depreciation is not the right mechanism to fund. It's more of a local government thing than a utilities thing. So yeah, again, it's just a different way of looking at it, I guess, in a water service entity.
Oh, so in theory, we could hope for the best, that something's going to work out in the future, and just not fund depreciation, and just, I mean, sounds like that's what some of them may be doing.
I don't think it's quite that. So when we move to renewal funding by loan, so at the moment we renewal fund, generally speaking, from reserves or from rates funded, the use of the assets. So all things being equal, the amount you're depreciating is about the amount you should be putting into your renewals, right? So what happens when you go to a loan funding model is that you loan fund, and you fund throughout the future life of that asset rather than funding for the people who've used it. It's a slight change, it creates some capacity from an affordability perspective up front, but then some ongoing costs to that. So it's just a different way to fund things.
So can you just define, because I reckon, look, the difference between the two different things, renewals and depreciation.
Yeah, so depreciation is the amount that the assets, essentially it's the amount the assets are used each year. So it's an accounting concept that's turned into a funding concept. So as your assets age, there's a certain amount of value that is depleted. So essentially the depreciation funding is, well, if the current ratepayers that are ratepayers this year have used this much of the asset, which is guided by depreciation because it's your useful life measure of how much your assets have been used in any year. So essentially it funds that share that have been used from the current ratepayers. Whereas if you look at renewal funding by loan, essentially you'll move to the next ratepayers will pay for that over 25 years, and we loan fund it rather than the people who have used it. So it's a site. So the people who use it in the future, when you replace an asset, it's just a different mechanism of funding, really.
But Sarah, the organisation has that depreciation money, and it can use it to fund, or could use it to fund other projects. Yes or no?
No, it is definitely ring fence for renewals. So again, we've got our different projects. So our renewal projects generally are funded by depreciation. We do get a little bit of loan funding in case of our book values increase massively. We haven't obviously funded enough depreciation, but we still need to replace the assets at a much higher cost. So sometimes you get loan funding of renewal assets, but we wouldn't use that renewal funding for level of service or growth assets. So growth funding comes from generally your developers, if growth pays for growth, and then new ratepayers, which pick up the OPEX costs, and then your renewal projects come from depreciation funding, which is the people who've used the asset, and then your level of service, that's what comes from loans, and that's the stuff that's quite hard to manage in a rates cap environment because you're adding more asset.
Well, just to clarify, renewal is literally what it means. It's we're keeping new the old stuff to keep it going. We're not, yes, that's, yep.
Yeah, so you're replacing, so there can be a mix of funding sources, but generally you're replacing the same asset with the same asset. Or keeping an asset up to that same standard, of course, in the case that you might be doing, capital maintenance, so, yeah. No, I think I have.
So that's interesting. So that depreciation money, I assume, is not sitting in the bottom of your drawer at your desk, knowing full well you don't have a desk with a
Yeah.
drawer. But to get, you know what I mean? So you were using that money for renewal projects.
Yeah, so it's ring fence to renewal projects. To cut a long story short, it goes into a reserve and then you only use that reserve to fund renewals projects, but all things being equal, you should be using about the amount that you get from rates each year for renewals. So there's no pot of money as such. And as I talked about before, in fact, some of our reserves, including our waters reserves, are actually a negative because of the amount of renewals that have happened probably either before or at a much higher cost than before because of the infrastructure construction inflation. So yeah, our reserves, we certainly don't have a pot of money sitting there, but I know a couple of the reserves are in positive but offset by the waters reserves generally. Yeah, and ring fence for that, so we don't use that for anything else. So just where was I? I talked about that. Yes, still, so depreciation is still linked to the financial prudence measures, which are the balanced budgets and essential services we talked about, and they'll still be linked to capital expenditure. So, you know, if we end up having this topic out on its own, it will be heavily linked to the level of service and infrastructure section. It's just, again, it's just that complexity which is driving it to be a potential topic on its own. Growth. So let's revisit last LTP. Generally speaking, there was a principle that growth pays for growth. The growth share of new assets primarily funded through development contributions, although again, sometimes the timing of that can be off. So where you, you know, you might require a new asset to be built, so a new treatment plant or something, and you haven't quite funded, you know, had that in the long-term plan long enough to fund that fully from growth. So there can be a little bit of a delay, and that's why growth funding can be challenging. Also, the operational costs of growth covered by the increase in rates revenue. So generally speaking, we get enough growth through rates to pay for the ongoing costs of these assets. Growth is excluded from rates increases affordability benchmark, so just a note there at the moment, that's what happens, and there is upfront financing pressure in some cases where you've got to replace assets, but you won't necessarily get the growth for another 30, 40 years. And as I said before, we still are expecting higher growth, supported by the population projections we've done in-house and have peer reviewed.
Quick question for me on that. My understanding is Stats New Zealand have a slightly different view of our growth projections, and if growth is excluded from rates increases, how are we going to bridge the gap between their view of the world and our independently peer-reviewed view of the world?
Yeah, so that is actually coming up on the next slide, and there's a little bit of complexity in that space, and also we are struggling with the growth on population versus growth in ratepayers. We know we service properties, we know rating legislation is that we have to service properties, we don't service population. So that's also a challenge, but yes, so as Councillor Taylor said, we have done our own projections because for a number of years I believe we used the Stats New Zealand projections and they were always off. Yes, so we now complete our own projections but get those peer reviewed. Not sure why Stats New Zealand view of the world is that Taupō isn't growing as much as it is, but we can see the growth, and I know certainly having a builder husband, certainly he's not quiet.
So just one other question there. Is that an issue for other councils? I'm not expecting an answer to that. And is that something we as a governance team should be looking at advocating through Local Government New Zealand to push back? Because if Stats New Zealand have a different view of the world, for us it's likely to be elsewhere, which is going to skew a whole range of things coming into a rates cap environment.
Yeah, so definitely advocation required on this. It does affect other councils, particularly what I was talking about before, the growth in ratepayers versus growth in population. So you look at Queenstown Lakes, the Thames Coromandels of the world have the same issue, right? So their population might not be growing, but their ratepayer base is, and they've still got to provide, rubbish collection. They've still got to provide capacity for peak population. They've still got to, have the roads for people and tourists to drive on, the people, or the, temporary accommodation as well, the people who are in that. So yes, it's definitely something that's shared. However, I know Julie has a visit from DIA next week, and we will be raising this exact challenge, because at the moment it is still, the rates cap is still going to be, or expected to be, a population-based growth model.
Yeah, and if I can just add to that, Sarah, too, just acknowledging that the Mayor's had several conversations with our local MP. We've raised it through LGNZ. We've had collaboration with particularly Thames Coromandel District Council around that particular fact, because it's similar to them, and of course it was highlighted in your submission through to DIA too, around the rates cap.
Councillor Campbell.
Yeah, I just have a question on growth pays for growth, and an example. I think you've told me that the second bridge of Waikato is forecast to be 75-80% funded by growth, and well, that's not the question, but I think you nodded. So what happens, for example, if that growth doesn't eventuate as we predicted, and it's much lower? Then we haven't got enough money to pay for the infrastructure. So what happens?
That's a great question, and actually something that we've seen elsewhere throughout the country, where particularly some of those high growth councils in the Waikato that didn't get their growth projections post-COVID, because people decided they didn't have to live in the Golden Triangle, that they could actually live in the Taupō or Taurongas of the world. So So I think that definitely has been seen, and it causes an incredible pressure on debt. So that is why your key assumptions, such as your growth assumptions, are really important things when you're adopting the long-term plan to consider, because they do affect so many things. If we're planning our program from a capital perspective based on a certain number of growth, and we don't hit that, then we've done projects too early. But there is a range of check-in points throughout. When you get your annual plan or you get your annual report, you should be able to see if your development contributions are coming in, if your ratepayer growth's coming in, and again, some of those forecasting things where you do have the ability to track that and then reconsider whether your current program is appropriate.
So I suppose the options are, in the fullness of time, if you planned to build something year 10 or whatever, but the growth is not as you predicted, so you either decide not to build it now, or we're going to build it now, but we're just going to go into a lot more debt. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, which all things need to be. Oh, sorry. All things need to be considered, given what we're seeing in growth, and that's where we'd come back and say, hey, look, this is the updated projections, because it affects debt, it affects when assets are timed, and it affects what's going on from what we're seeing from a growth perspective as well.
Councillor Greensley.
It's not really a question, Your Worship. I just want to support our CEO in advocacy to DIA and the MP. The poor projections in terms of stats and population has affected our medical centre. It means we're not funded as we should have been because of those sorts of things. So just very much support any advocacy in getting those figures right for our district, because they're not being recognised at present. So thank you for doing that.
So can I just ask a follow-up question there? So what we're talking about, the challenge that we're facing, is that we may have more houses we need to provide services for, but they're not lived in. So the population isn't growing, but the number of houses we're servicing are. Yeah, thank you.
So from a growth perspective, what has changed, and some of it, which was a great segue, we've just talked about, but we're still anticipating that higher growth, and we have modelled that and completed the workshop with Council. However, from a rates cap perspective, the formula and the growth factor that's included in that calculation will need to be taken into account. So depending on where that lands, we may need to align our planning growth assumption with our revenue cap. You can't have a revenue cap assuming a lower growth and then try and manage a higher number of projects assuming a different growth model under that. It would cause funding misalignment. So that's going to be a really challenging one to manage. Again, we can't go ahead and complete a whole lot of growth projects in the long-term plan and show our costs are increasing, but then the revenue cap sits at a lower level. So, I feel for Philip and Kendall and the team who have done a lot of work on these growth assumptions just to be waiting for central government to give direction on that revenue cap. So, again, we just flagging that may need alignment. And development levies versus development contributions. Now, I know Aidan and Kendall mentioned this the other week, so how will this impact our growth funding? We don't have our growth projects yet. The legislation's still, we're waiting for some of that detail to come through and people to work out the different mechanisms and whether it's better off for council to proceed with development levies earlier or development contributions until we have to change. That's something that needs to be modelled, so that will impact our growth funding.
I've sort of been keeping an eye on this one a little bit, and even with the new legislation, I haven't seen too much difference. Is there something I'm missing?
Look, it's really hard until you get into some of that detail, but I agree fundamentally, I guess we were a little bit concerned that it may put a bit more costs up front, and I know there's a number of things happening in this space. Our GFA is actually looking at how to fund development levies in the future in an off-balance sheet perspective. So some of the things that are happening in the sector, we're assuming there may be assumption that the sector will be worse off. That isn't what I have seen in the legislation, but again, sometimes the devil's in the detail, and we have to work through that. And of course, until we've got our growth projects too, it's hard to give any advice in that respect. Look, I've finished. Questions? I think you've asked them throughout, but if there's any final questions on those three topics.
Thank you, Sarah.
Okay, we're back to our activity again. To keep the pep up, today we're going to break the back of this activity. We're doing 7 activities. We've got some great ones, some big ones to start. That'll bring us to 20 out of 23 by the end of the day, so we really will have got there. I just want to reiterate, this is your chance to really shape the next 3 years in terms of council's financial position, in terms of rates impact, and the council services that we provide. So you've got unprecedented information there on the cost of all council's activities, the drivers of those costs, and some of the options that could be explored for reducing what council provides. And we're trying to identify 5 where you'll get advice on options to potentially reduce those services and save some rates costs. So that's just areas that we'll go away and explore further, identify what the options might look like, how long they might take to phase in, what the savings might be, and then come back with that advice. So you're really just buying choices. And if you don't like the list that we had at the halfway point, this is your opportunity to get some new ones on that list and bump some of those ones off that you didn't like. So we're really at the water trough here, and this is your chance to be proactive and shape the next 3 years. So that's it from me. Pep, done. We'll break as usual. This side over to, what do we have over there? Transport. And this side to Parks and Reserves. These are quite big ones. Hopefully 15 minutes is enough, but we'll just see how we go.
I'm just going to say, outside of our waters, in terms of being big activities, transport and parks and reserves are quite big areas within the council. So, yeah, there's quite a bit to cover from these teams, and we're really lucky we've got the staff here from both parks and reserves. So we've got Greg and Julie, and then for the transport team we have Roger and Claire and Iselda as well. So we're all prepped and ready to go. So off we go with the red dots.
Councillor Greenslade.
We'll start with transport. Broadly do the same format as last time. Having a look at the charts, we've got pretty high importance to the community, and some area for improvement in terms of satisfaction of the community potentially. And then the review space, we seem to have a bunch around a deep sort of dive review. It'd be interesting to understand what you're thinking there. And then a few in the do more space, potentially reflecting the cost pressures in that area. So here's the chance to give us your specific feedback on what it is in particular you would like us to go away and look at, if anything.
Do you want that now, Aidan, some feedback?
Yep, and discussion around the table. We're trying to get broad agreement from the whole table.
Councillor Campbell.
Oh yeah, through the chair, just talking to Roger just now, it's clearly, and this is a transport issue, but it's to do with trees, street trees, in particular oak trees in particular. We've got lots of them in the region, well, Turangi, Lockviews, Kinloch, I think, which are a high maintenance burden. So really the question of should we be keeping them, or should some of them be taken down? It's a legitimate question. I think Sandra might say no, but it is a question.
So are we in debate time here as well?
Yep, so what we're hoping for is that you discuss ideas and come up with hopefully some sort of consensus or majority view of what you mean when you'd like us to go away and look at anything in particular. Then we'll write that up and try and get a debate or adoption of that final advice. This is specifically what we'd like you to go away and look at and get further advice on. So here's a time to discuss and shape what that advice might be.
So it's question and discussion time, Wahine.
Yeah, I kind of heard a bit further from the trees in that our transport team are actually really strapped, like literally strapped in the operational side of things in terms of managing that. The trees are just like a little droplet on one side, but if you saw the evidence that was presented to us over there in terms of you got the sucker truck that goes around and clears through the gutters, I suppose, but then once they collect all of the leaves from the gutters, there's still a whole bunch of leaves on the footpath that tend to get wet from the rain that we can't collect because that's not the job of the vacuum sucker truck. So it's like, well, what's the point in putting funds there? And then I kind of heard that there's actually no emergency backup fund in our transport side to respond to massive weather events, which we're seeing increase across the district. More recently, the last couple of weeks, the high wind levels that have smashed trees, and if we don't have any backup fund, well, we're going to be using the funds that we actually need to try and get that job done. And then we're just going to exhaust. We're going to deplete it all, and that's what I've heard is that they're really strapped in that area, along with some of the policy and positions from central government making things much more harder in terms of how we spend our money just directly on potholes. I don't think it's been working for them, and I think that we need to really consider assisting in that area, if anything.
Councillor Greenslade.
Yes, thank you, Councillor Murch. The last sentence is definitely something which I would support, assisting that particular department in managing. I mean, I think as councillors we've got to be very careful that we don't belong to the Flat Earth Society and say that just because something's a problem then we have to get rid of it. Trees are a joy to people all over the world. They are one of the joys of our lives, actually, and I couldn't imagine us not having trees around us. And there are many, many countries in the world where people just simply don't have trees because, again, they can't afford the space to actually allow a tree to grow. I think Turangi is a really, really good example of perhaps a little bit of investment in managing our trees. We adopted a bit of a Flat Earth Society down some of our streets where we got rid of all the trees to replace the curbing, so that's concrete got put in its place. and there have been trees to replace them, but it's a really difficult one, because the one thing, and of course then you have this discussion about whether it should be a native tree or whether it should be a deciduous tree. So this district is what we would call a continental climate. We have hot weather in the summer and we have cold weather in the winter. So the deciduous trees which come from that part of the world offer shelter from the heat of the summer. Very easy to get up to 40 degrees in Turangi some days, and in the winter of course we need that warmth, we need that sunshine, so we want no leaves on our trees, and this also contributes to the health of our people as well too. And of course there are all the studies that show how trees reduce pollution in an area. Yeah, we're talking 25% in terms of cars and that type of thing. So I agree with Councillor Murch, it's an issue that we have to look at and say how can we support this department in managing it, and we need to be thinking long and hard before we say get rid of a tree just because of a problem. I think the day we brand trees a problem, we're the ones with the problem.
Thank you, Councillor Greenslade. Councillor Foreman.
Yeah, mine's more around the fact that I don't think, well, there's certain streets that haven't actually been planned for what's to come. So there are streets in Turangi where the trees have gotten too bad, the pipe work is not up to scratch. So it's having a look where our problem areas are and maybe looking to support those better. I'm actually more inclined to say our roads are actually maintained really well. Can we pull back to a point where we maintain the asset so we're not got a big bill, but at the same time try and ease off a bit on doing so much reactionary work, but really start looking at where those areas are where we're getting the flooding. Why are we getting that flooding? You know, there's some problem areas that we could possibly work on and go from there.
Councillor Taylor.
Thank you. I put my little dot on the bottom section there. Given the operating environment we are now in and how much further it is likely to deteriorate, my view is we need to do a fundamental review of all the activities we're engaged in. And in terms of what we do, I don't believe there is a good answer to this, but I would like to see a list of least worst responses down to worst of what we can do, because we're simply not going to be able to do it. And I'm just watching the price of fuel at the moment and the likelihood of where that's going, which has a flow-on effect, and it's not going to end anytime soon. So my view is that we need to have a deep dive into all of the projects and go, yep, we need to do this, but we can't. And these are the reasons why, so that we're able to make some informed choices. It's unpalatable whichever way you look at it.
Councillor Campbell.
Oh yeah, look, I've just, if we're talking about debating of transport issues, I mean, one of the biggest ticket items we have is the growth project of the proposed second bridge over the Waikato, and we simply have not had a debate in these chambers as to whether it's necessary. I'm not convinced it's necessary personally. That doesn't mean I can't be convinced, but I'm not convinced it is not a necessary. That is a political choice to do, and there has been no debate in these chambers, so I've got to point that out as a... Oh, sorry, the second bridge over the Waikato. It's about the biggest ticket item in there, certainly as a growth project, and it's not one of these level of service projects being imposed upon us, as in the water projects. It's a choice. So I'm just suggesting, well, I don't know how can we possibly proceed with something like that without actually having a debate about it.
Thanks, Councillor Campbell. That is going to be one of the projects that we bring back to a specific workshop so that you can have that discussion in more detail. So we will be getting that in your calendars shortly, but that is one of our significant projects that we want to have a deep dive with you, and you'll have that opportunity to discuss it.
Councillor Cameron.
I had my dot for transport on do more, actually. I realise that aligning our work with the NZTA funding is important. I think, obviously, using that to our advantage as much as possible, but we are on the back foot with a lot of our renewals. Our roads aren't in great condition. They're just patching things up. As soon as it rains, it's getting into the substrate, and then they have to build a whole new road. So we've got an opportunity now to do some catch up that we won't have very, very soon. So in my opinion, this is something we need to prioritise in the next sort of 3-year work plan if we can, so that later on we can work within our rates cap margins, because we need to do some work on this. And I heard very clearly that a lot of what we're doing is band-aid. We're putting a band-aid on our roads, and we actually need to do a better job than that. So in my opinion, this is one we need to put some focus and some resources towards.
Councillor Murch.
Yeah, no, I was pretty much going to say something on around the similar lines to Rachel there. I kind of heard that most of, when we get funding from NZTA, Waka Kotahi, we can only put that funding where they say we're allowed to put that funding, and that's created some real challenges for our transport team in terms of how do we actually be efficient with the spend when we have all of these parameters around us that don't actually allow us to do that. So I just wanted to clarify, I put my dot on the increase and improve.
Councillor Mananui.
Yep, agree from the passionate presentation over there that the sort of ambulance is already at the bottom of the cliff by the sounds of it. So would support one of the few, I think, it sounds like, where we could potentially support it more. But also agree with Kevin that process of a bit of a review would allow us to at least tell the story, do some selling, pick the best of a bad bunch type of thing.
Councillor Campbell.
Kendall, just responding. We're talking about a workshop for the Northern Gateway, the bridge, the second Waikato bridge. I know that's necessary and worthwhile, but I just want to point out that yes, workshops are not times for debate, and I'm just going to point out that it needs to be debated at some point subsequently after that workshop, but to just swish ahead without doing that, well, it shouldn't. There should be an actual debate, not just a workshop anyway.
Kendall, do you want to?
Oh, I was just going to say, I totally hear you, and another reason why we're having these conversations, and we will have those further deep dives into those significant projects, is to really start to frame up those engagement questions with the community that we're hoping to go out in May with. So again, that's what we're trying to extract from these conversations, is what are the questions you want to be asking the community about, and coming from your perspective, the bridge is definitely something you would like to talk to them early about. So we'll keep going on that.
Chief Executive, I could see you're itching to say something.
Just reiterating for those that are watching on live stream that obviously that was a topic for consultation in the last LTP too. So I see that will probably be a significant project that we'll be raising in consultation this time around too. So Councillor, of course you will have the chance to debate that and make a decision on whether you include that in the LTP and what we need for consultation from the community.
Councillor Woodward, your turn.
Thank you, Your Worship. I just wanted to support what Rachel was saying there before about our roads being band-aided, and support Kevin's response about needing a full review. It's definitely going to be a challenge in the environment and the financial environment that we're in, but as we've seen specifically out here in our Mangakino Pauakani communities with all of this rain that we've had, there's been some significant damages to the roads, and trees are definitely something that does take up time and money as well with them on our roads during storms. But I do agree with Sandra's comments before, and I do believe that trees are very important in our communities and for our health. And just a note on that second bridge as well that Councillor Campbell brought up. I tend to agree with Councillor Campbell there and wonder if it is something that is going to be necessary, but looking forward to debating that when we have those workshops.
Thank you, Hope. Councillor Greenslade.
Thank you, Worship. We must be special in Turangi. Our roads are lovely. They're really lovely, though. We don't have. I don't think. Do we? We haven't got a problem with roads down there. No. So perhaps we walk more often underneath the lovely trees. I just wanted to make a comment, particularly, this is sort of getting in the weeds a little bit, but one of the staff members mentioned to me about the new subdivisions and the developers planting trees, and it's an area in which we need to give them much more guidance. They've got very narrow berms and they're planting what are beautiful trees today and a nightmare for Taupō District Council tomorrow. So that's just something, when following on from what Councillor Taylor said, some things we need to look at doing differently, and we need to flag that.
Thank you for that, Councillor Greenslade. I think one of the points that we were here about was just how we're going to try and get the budget of this organisation back in line with the anticipated rate caps that are coming, and we've got to balance it up with huge, what I expect to be huge increasing costs. Asphalt is up 40, what's the percentage increase in asphalt that we heard about today?
50%.
So there are significant increased costs that somehow we've got to manage. And I think if you manage to get Sarah aside, she said our roads compared to the Australian ones are pretty damn good. So I think this is the dilemma we've got to face. We're actually here to, I understood we're here today to look at how we can reduce these costs. And that's what we've got to focus on.
Sorry, through the chair, I don't think it's purely just to reduce costs, it's also to future-proof and make good, prudent financial decisions that will set us up for a rates cap environment. So whilst we might not quite get there with this LTP, it's because we have to do things like this now before we can't. So I think we're balancing more than just reducing costs. Sorry.
We've also got to increase income where we can. I appreciate that. Anyone else got any comments?
Oh, just float an idea, Your Worship. Just maybe we don't go purchasing large volumes of bitumen and asphalt during an oil crisis. That's all.
That's certainly something, Aidan, that I guess you can do. Is phase it in when, or delay stuff. Is that right?
Okay, we'll move on to Parks and Reserves now. We've got about 10 minutes and then there'll be a break for lunch. So again, same process, have a discussion, debate, and try and give us some clear feedback. Where it's looking, is there's quite a strong view there that we should be thinking about how we can save money in this space. It'd be good if you could be specific about what you were thinking in that space. Where are the areas where you see potential?
Councillor Murch.
Yep, I was just going to kind of speak to my points over there. It was a good kind of conversation and overview of where we could potentially save costs in the reserves and park space. Mostly around actually trying to let the tile regenerate itself, let the tile maintain itself. Lots of times in the summer, I know we have beautiful flowers and wildflowers growing all over the place that are actually good for the bees. So maybe we could cut back on lawn maintenance and things like that. And it's actually ironic that we just talked about how are we going to actually fund this. Well, looking in that direction, it looks like we all came to quite a consensus around actually looking at how we could maybe decrease and save costs in the parks and reserves space. So I really appreciated that conversation over there from the team. Thanks.
Councillor Mananui.
Yep, tautoko that the rationalisation kōrero was good. I think we could do it in a way to bring or there's key areas that will be low-hanging fruit. I think if we could wrap a story around that to help sell it to the community would be good. And also back to rationalisation, there's possibly worth a review around playgrounds around the place. I mean, Taupō's well known and they're great, but you know, possibly we could do a little trimming back in areas. But yep.
Thank you, Steve. Councillor Campbell.
Oh yeah, just rationalisation of reserves. Certainly, that's an opportunity which we could have been taking up a long time ago. But I think it's a good thing about. I think these rate caps are pushing ahead something that we just have to sort of start considering. The second thing I worked out, erosion control. It seems that to date, mostly we've been building stuff lakeside, which because we can, that's where we can build stuff lakeside. But it's quite apparent to me that a more efficient way, and it depends upon it's an engineering design question, but there is often a more efficient way of doing it, and that's building stuff offshore on the lake bed, and that's that obviously requires the owner of the lake bed to agree. But I'm just saying, if we're serious about erosion control, where we don't want and we want to spend less doing it, that's what's required.
Councillor Taylor.
That would require an agreement with the group you don't want to partner with. But anyway, my question is around the development contributions and new developments. Part of that is instead of cash, we take land for reserves. And I guess the question comes to how much is enough? And we keep getting free land as part of that, but it's a gift that keeps on giving because we then got to maintain it. And I wonder whether this is a policy setting question as opposed to just parks and reserves. And there is an overlap there. So I guess the challenge I throw out, whether it's a question, is do we need to reconsider, big development occurs, do we need another small reserve when there's a slightly bigger one just down the road which is perfectly adequate? That would be my challenge there.
Thank you, Councillor Taylor. Councillor Murch.
Oh yeah, no, I was just going back to that building on the lake bed thing, and I kind of thought, I don't know if it's a question for this time, but just around council infrastructure that is already on the lake bed. Do we have any of that? Is that like the what do you call it, the boat ramps and stuff? Council encroachments on the lake bed? We don't have any council encroachments on the lake bed?
Chief Executive will answer that, or attempt to.
So perhaps it's a separate time rather than this, because this is a conversation about levels of service in terms of parks and reserves. So we can come back to that, but yes, the boat ramps are not ours, they belong to DIA, but absolutely we have assets that reflect the lake, but that's, I think, as a separate conversation at a separate time.
Councillor Cameron.
Yeah, I'm just going to throw my weight behind the rationalisation discussion on parks as well as reserves. I've never been much of a fan of the Seychelles over the playgrounds either. And, you know, the erosion discussion, I certainly realise that there's an agreement in place between Mercury and the Waikato Regional Council, but I would like to try and push some more discussion with them so that there is a greater understanding of the impact that the rising and lowering of the lake level is doing, and how they can, you know, help reduce that for the benefit of the community, because it's not just the council, it's not just Mercury, it's the people that use the areas. It's Tapuwae Haruru that we've spent a lot of money on, so I would like to see a little bit of work done there if we can. And yeah, agree with Kevin, you know, the DC's development contributions. I think there's already been a move towards, you know, the financial contribution rather than land, and I certainly endorse that. We do have some legislation coming through that will probably have to guide us on our policy settings there, but yeah, those are the few things that I think that we can look at.
Councillor Greenslade.
Thank you, Worship. Councillor Murch and I are on the same page again. The last council will be very used to me screaming and yelling, stop mowing, stop mowing, stop mowing. And I concur completely, stop mowing, except in areas where we actually use the land for sports and recreation, and it's clear that that land is there. You know, this fixation that New Zealanders have got with pristine mown lawns, need to move on from that mentality. It's an attitude that we can't afford any longer, and we need to move away from it. Another issue that came up in the last triennium was encroachment. And I'm thinking maybe it's time, again, when we look at doing things differently, that we look at some of the council land that has been encroached on and been incorporated into people's property, and is it time to say to them, if you wish to encroach, continue to encroach, would you like to buy this land off us? And have an attitude where if it's not being used by us as a reserve and it's being used by somebody else, they can buy it. Again, it takes it off our books. And I definitely agree with this business of every time you get a new development, you get more land and more costs and more on the ratepayer. Yes, we need to have the money that supports what we've actually already got in place, make what we've got beautiful, look after what we've got beautiful, and big old rethink about what we actually don't need. In Turangi, for instance, and I know that the Ngāti Turangi Tukua draft reserves management plan was looking at this as well too. We've got tracts of land which are just sort of gateways, corridors that nobody uses, and they cost us money. And again, another area that we need to look at, rationalisation, thinking about how we can do things better, always.
Thank you, Councillor Greenslade. Councillor Woodward.
Thank you. I just wanted to also support that idea of cutting down our lawn mowing. Absolutely agree with that one. It's really good to have those flowers growing for the bees and the wildlife. Plus, a little bit longer lawn actually keeps things not as hot as well. And we could also do community volunteer groups, and they could do some of the weeding. We have great gardeners, particularly in our community, so planting things would be quite easy. Also, yesterday I attended a presentation on Lake Taupō and its erosion issues, which I will be bringing to the rest of council to have a look at as well. I think it's a very worthwhile presentation, and the gentleman who presented it has some pretty interesting ideas that could help.
Thank you, Hope. Councillor Campbell.
Well, yeah, just two things. First is, when we asked, I think it was 300 grand we're doing on shade sales, Councillor Cameron brought up, I was never 100% convinced myself of that expense either, actually. The shade sales, sorry, yeah. But the other point is just with, Councillor Taylor made a comment about, well, the implication was that, and this is to do with the erosion control, the implication, reading between the lines or whatever you want to call it, seemed to me that unless we go into partnership nicely with the lake bed owner, then they won't let us build stuff on the lake bed for the betterment of lakeside communities. Perhaps I heard it wrong, but that's what I was hearing. I did say nicely.
So I'm happy to respond.
Huh?
I can't understand things for you. What happens between your ears is for you to sort out. My statement sits. Words are what they are. How you interpret them is entirely up to you.
Righto, gentlemen, thank you very much. Moving on to Councillor Woodward. You've got a comment? We are running short on time. We've got about 2 minutes left.
All right, I'll just make this really quick. I just wanted to add in there, Rachel, I appreciate your point on shade sales. However, I do disagree. I believe shade sales are absolutely important. It's actually something I've been trying to find funding for one of our parks in our community, which isn't usable in the peak of summer because of the heat. So shade sales there would be very high priority. Thank you.
Thank you, Hope. Aidan, Councillor Cameron, you.
There may be some areas that require shade sales, but I don't think they're required on every single playground we've got, and I think there are perhaps too many playgrounds as well. So I just think we need to be a bit more subjective with where we are putting certain things like shade sales, because they have a limited shelf life. It's operational, they've got to put them up, take them down, put them up, take them down. There's health and safety risks because kids are jumping up on them. So, there's a lot to consider there. So, appreciate that, some shade is good at playgrounds, but maybe we just plant more trees.
Aidan, do you want to try and...
John, I'd just like to say, I speak to a lot of people, and the feedback I've had on the shade sales has been fabulous. A lot of support, and remember when we did the public consultation, it was highly dealt with. A lot of people wanted. It was a top priority for a lot of people, and when we haven't got the trees, the shade sales are really helpful.
Duncan, Councillor Cameron, we're actually over time. You got a quick question there?
Oh yeah, no. Oh no, it's I just thought of this now. Look, it's a comment about, because we're on the topic of parks, reserves, playgrounds. It has struck me since coming down here that because I see myself as a little bit of a playground expert because I've had the kids around and used to use a few of them in Auckland and stuff, and I've seen some really impressive playgrounds built, say West Auckland where I'm from, big stuff, which. But here, the playgrounds I've seen built here, I would I think of the one, our local one, the Domain one. It's more, we seem to be aiming for 8-year-olds and under, and we seem to, and that would definitely applies to the Turangi one, and it seems to me that the playgrounds that do get built, that there's a lot of money gets put into aesthetics and cultural stuff on the playground, and not enough focus on the kids and their enjoyment.
Thank you.
So I'll just suggest moving forward when we do new playgrounds, more emphasis on the kids' having fun than anything else.
The emphasis is going to be on less playgrounds. Now, Councillor Foreman, can you do it in 30 seconds? I'm getting
it's
like
more
my
of
smoker break.
I appreciate all the work that the team has been doing over here, but I do think there are a lot of areas where we can pull back. So I'm looking forward to seeing a review.
Thank you, Councillor Foreman. Aidan, are you ready to?
Yeah, thank you very much. That's been very good feedback in both areas. Thank you. We'll break there. More to come later this afternoon.
Yeah, so for everyone online, we are breaking now. And
So just through you, Your Worship, we're coming back at 12:30 in terms of our JMA briefing.
Yeah.
Is there lunch available?
Hey, will it be the same log on for Hope?
No, it'll be a separate one.
So I'll text her.